In the cold September of 1297, the most powerful army in Christendom, a wall of English steel and war horses, arrived on the banks of the River Forth at Stirling, Scotland. Their mission was simple and brutal: to crush, once and for all, a humiliating peasant rebellion. On the other side of the river, waiting for them, was not a noble army, but what they saw as a rabble of ragged rebels, led by a nameless outlaw. For the English lords, the war was practically won. They only needed to cross a narrow wooden bridge to dispense the king's justice. But they did not know that for the man who awaited them, William Wallace, that bridge was not a path to victory. It was a weapon. The legend of the Battle of Stirling Bridge is the chronicle of how one man turned his enemy's greatest strength, its crushing arrogance, into its fatal weakness. William Wallace did not win this battle by following the rules of medieval warfare. He won it by breaking them all. He did not fight the English army. He fought the geography. With the patience of a predator stalking its prey, he deliberately allowed the bridge to strangle the mighty English army, luring the cream of feudal cavalry into a death trap where their numbers, their armor, and their imposing war horses were worth absolutely nothing. This is the epic of how discipline and perfect timing became weapons deadlier than the sword. It is the story of a Scottish David who did not face Goliath in an honorable duel, but tricked him into stumbling and breaking his own neck through his own clumsiness. The victory at Stirling Bridge was not forged with steel, but with the mind of a man who saw what the most experienced generals in England could not: that sometimes the best strategy is not to attack, but simply to wait for your enemy to destroy himself. This is the story of the birth of a legend and Scotland's most iconic victory. At the heart of the Scottish rebellion beat two fires. One was William Wallace, a knight of low birth turned charismatic guerrilla leader, a man driven by a thirst for personal revenge and a fervent patriotism that ignited the souls of the common people. The other was Andrew Moray, a nobleman with military experience who brought legitimacy and crucial tactical knowledge to the cause. Together, they were the embodiment of Scottish fury, the unlikely alliance of the common folk and the nobility. Their army was a reflection of their desperation, a force of barely 2,300 infantry, mostly commoners armed with little more than long wooden spears, and perhaps 180 horsemen. Their only motivation was freedom. Facing them stood the giant, the might of King Edward I of England. But it was a giant with two heads that could not agree. The nominal command was held by John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, a cautious veteran commander who understood the dangers of the Scottish terrain. But the real power on the field was wielded by Hugh de Cressingham, the king's treasurer in Scotland. Cressingham was not a soldier, but an arrogant, obese, and universally despised cleric who saw the Scots as subhuman savages. His only goal was to crush the rebellion as quickly and cheaply as possible, regardless of the risk. The English force was, on paper, an instrument of annihilation, a professional army of between 9,000 and 12,000 men, a number that dwarfed the rebel force. Its core was its heavy cavalry, over 2,000 armored knights and men-at-arms, the most feared and effective shock force in Europe. They were the tanks of the Middle Ages, capable of running down any infantry formation. Their fatal weakness, however, was not military, but psychological, an absolute contempt for their enemy. Cressingham, in particular, was incapable of conceiving that a band of peasants could pose the slightest threat to the might of England, a blindness that would lead him to make the greatest mistake of his life. The chessboard was the landscape around Stirling, and the central piece was the bridge. It was a narrow structure of wood and stone, so constricted that only two horsemen, or perhaps 3 men on foot, could cross it side by side. The ground to which the bridge led, on the north bank of the River Forth, was a low-lying, marshy plain, soft and treacherous terrain, completely unsuited for heavy cavalry to form up and execute an effective charge. From the high ground of Abbey Craig, Wallace and Moray saw it all. The terrain was not an obstacle for them. It was the main mechanism of their death trap. The genius of Wallace and Moray's plan lay not in a complex combat tactic, but in the discipline of inaction. It was a non-battle. Their strategy was to let the enemy defeat itself, using the bridge as a funnel and English arrogance as the piston that would push them into the trap. They positioned their forces deliberately out of sight, on the wooded slopes, and demanded iron discipline from their men. No one would move. No one would make a sound. They would wait, As patient as hunters he saw us until a sufficient number of English troops had crossed the bridge and were trapped, with their only escape route now blocked by their own comrades trying to cross. The tension on the field was palpable. The English, confident and loud, prepared for what they considered a simple execution. The Scots, silent and hidden, awaited the signal. The fate of Scotland's independence would not be decided by the strength of arms, but by the outcome of a battle of wills between the caution of one English general and the suicidal arrogance of another. The moment that would turn an outlaw into a national hero is about to arrive. If you wish to witness how patience and intelligence can turn a simple bridge into a weapon of mass annihilation, make sure you are subscribed, because the trap is about to spring. The morning of September 11th, 1297, dawned with a fatal hesitation in the English camp. Surrey, the veteran commander, eyed the narrow bridge with suspicion. His instinct told him it was a trap. He knew of a nearby ford, wider, that would allow his cavalry to cross the river en masse and easily flank the Scottish force. It was the correct tactical move, the safe option. But then, arrogance intervened. Hugh de Cressingham, impatient and eager for glory, publicly mocked Surrey's caution. He insisted that any delay was a waste of the king's money and demanded a frontal, direct, and crushing charge across the bridge. Pressured and humiliated, Surrey yielded. With that decision, the fate of the English army was sealed. The English vanguard, led by Cressingham himself on his warhorse, began the slow and arduous crossing of the bridge. It was an agonizing process. Knights, Welsh archers, and infantry crowded onto the narrow structure, creating a perfect bottleneck. The flow of men was a trickle, not a flood. It took hours, the entire morning, for a significant force, yet still a fraction of the total army, to manage the crossing and begin the difficult task of trying to form battle lines on the marshy, soft ground of the far bank, under the unseen gaze of the Scots. From the heights of Abbey Craig, hidden among the trees, William Wallace and Andrew Moray watched with nerves of steel. They saw the first knights cross. They waited. They saw the infantry follow. They waited. They let more and more English troops enter the trap, stretching their line of communication across the bridge to its point of maximum vulnerability. The timing had to be perfect. Too soon, and the English might retreat. Too late, and they might form a bridgehead strong enough to resist. They waited until some 400 men, including the bulk of the elite heavy cavalry, were on the other side, trapped in a meander of the river. Then, Wallace gave the order. A single Scottish war horn tore through the silence, and then another and another, until the hills echoed with the sound of impending death. From the slopes of the hill, a wall of men emerged. The Scottish spearmen, grouped in compact formations known as schiltrons, charged down. They did not run in a disorderly fashion, but as a disciplined hedgehog of steel. While the main body advanced towards the disorganized English force, a small detachment had a single, crucial mission: not to fight the cavalry, but to run at full speed and seize control of the northern end of the bridge. The maneuver was executed to perfection. The small group of Scots secured the bridgehead, cutting off the only escape route. The trap had snapped shut. The thousands of English soldiers who had crossed were now completely trapped. With no possibility of retreat and no hope of receiving reinforcements from the main army, which watched in horror from the southern bank, panic began to spread through the English ranks. The terrain they had scorned became their mortal enemy. The swampy ground prevented their heavy war horses from gaining the speed needed for an effective charge. England's elite cavalry, the terror of European battlefields, found itself helpless, bogged down in the mud. Their horses became easy targets. The Scottish schiltrons advanced inexorably. They were walls of 12-foot-long spears, a formation that cavalry simply could not break. The knights charged, only to see their mounts impaled on a forest of steel points. Once unhorsed, their heavy armor made them vulnerable, and they were slaughtered by the Scots with daggers and short swords. What should have been a battle became a one-sided butchery. The English infantry and Welsh archers, caught between the charge of the spearmen and the river at their backs, were overrun. Discipline disintegrated. The formation became a mass of terrified men fighting for their lives in the mud and water. The vanguard of the mighty English army was being systematically annihilated, while its commander-in-chief watched powerlessly from the safety of the other bank. Hugh de Cressingham himself, the architect of the catastrophe, was one of the first casualties. His arrogance had led him to lead the charge, and he was pulled from his horse and slaughtered by the Scottish infantry. His death symbolized the total collapse of English authority and morale on the battlefield. The Scottish victory was absolute, a perfect demonstration of how strategy, patience, and the clever use of terrain could annihilate a far superior force. Seeing the irreversible disaster, Surrey, from the south bank, made the only decision left to save the rest of his army. He ordered the wooden bridge to be destroyed and, in an act of panic, abandoned the men remaining on the north bank to their fate. Then, he mounted his horse and began a desperate flight south, not stopping until he reached the safety of the English border. The army that had come to crush a rebellion was retreating in complete disarray, humiliated and shattered. Wallace and Moray's victory was total. They had not fought a battle of attrition, but one of annihilation. They had used the very structure of the enemy army, its vanguard of heavy cavalry followed by infantry, and turned it against them. They had turned English confidence into recklessness, their discipline into a march to the slaughterhouse, and their bridge into a tombstone. The roar of the English lion had been silenced by the ingenuity and courage of the Scottish thistle. The battlefield fell silent, covered by the bodies of thousands of English soldiers. The River Forth was stained red with the blood of the invaders. The small, ragged army of rebels stood victorious over the remains of one of the most powerful military forces of its time. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was over, and it had proven to the world an immortal truth, that no army, however great, is invincible if its mind is narrower than the bridge it tries to cross. The legend of William Wallace had just been born, not in a heroic charge, but in the stillness of the wait, in the brilliance of a perfectly executed trap. He had shown that a leader's true power lies not in the strength of his arm, but in the sharpness of his mind and his ability to inspire common men to achieve extraordinary feats. The freedom of Scotland, though it would be a long and bloody struggle, had its true beginning on that bridge, on that September day. The statistics of the carnage at Stirling Bridge are a testament to the perfection of the Scottish trap. The vanguard of the English army was, for all intents and purposes, annihilated. Over 5,000 English soldiers, including hundreds of armored knights and nobles, were slaughtered on the north bank of the river or drowned trying to escape. In comparison, Scottish casualties were minimal, although the victory came at a tragic cost. Andrew Moray, the co-commander and tactical brain of the rebellion was mortally wounded in the battle, a loss that would be felt deeply in the months to come. The fate of the English commanders was a reflection of their conduct. Hugh de Cressingham, the arrogant treasurer, met a particularly gruesome end. He was pulled down, killed, and, in an act of supreme contempt, his body was flayed by the victorious Scots. On the other hand, John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, who had watched the disaster helplessly from the safety of the south bank, staged a humiliating flight. Abandoning his army, his treasury, and his honor, he galloped south at full speed, not stopping until he reached the border town of Berwick, effectively leaving Scotland in the hands of the rebels. The immediate victory for the Scots was overwhelming. They seized immense spoils from the abandoned English camp, including supplies, money, and weapons that would allow them to continue the fight. Psychologically, the effect was electrifying. The news that a force of commoners had annihilated the elite of English cavalry spread like wildfire throughout Scotland, inspiring thousands to join the rebellion. For the first time in years, the independence of Scotland seemed not an impossible dream, but a tangible, real possibility. The most significant political and military consequence of the Battle of Stirling Bridge was that it shook the foundations of feudal power across Europe. It demonstrated conclusively and bloodily that a disciplined and well-positioned infantry force, armed with simple long spears, could defeat armored heavy cavalry, which until then had been considered the undisputed queen of the battlefield. This tactical lesson would have enormous repercussions in future wars. In the short term, the victory temporarily freed Scotland from English control, driving out their armies and administrators. William Wallace, the outlaw, was named Guardian of the Kingdom of Scotland, becoming the de facto ruler of the country. The event instantly became the foundational myth of Scottish resistance and the legend of William Wallace. The battle transformed Wallace from a simple rebel into a national hero, an immortal symbol of the struggle for freedom against overwhelming tyranny. He became the personification of the idea that ingenuity, courage, and love of one's homeland can overcome brute force and oppression. The story of Stirling Bridge has been told and retold over the centuries, becoming a cornerstone of Scottish national identity, a perpetual reminder of their ability to defy and defeat impossible odds. The reaction of King Edward III of England was one of absolute fury. The humiliating defeat at Stirling forced him to abandon his campaigns in France and turn his attention and the full might of his kingdom toward the subjugation of Scotland. Although the freedom won at Stirling was short-lived, and Wallace would eventually be defeated and brutally executed, the victory lit a flame that would never be completely extinguished. It inspired future leaders, like Robert the Bruce, to continue the fight, a fight that would ultimately culminate in Scotland's independence at the Battle of Bannockburn, nearly 2 decades later. The echo of Stirling resonates as a timeless lesson about arrogance and underestimation. The English army was not defeated by Scottish spears, but by its own contempt for its enemy. They refused to believe that a force they considered inferior could be a threat, and they paid the ultimate price for their blindness. The battle is a perpetual reminder to all armies and leaders that one must never underestimate an opponent, no matter how weak or insignificant they may seem, especially when that opponent is fighting for their very survival on their own ground. There is a final detail, a macabre epilogue that encapsulates the brutality of the era and the intensity of the hatred the Scots felt for their oppressors. The chronicles of the time relate that the skin of the hated treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, was not simply discarded. It was carefully cut into strips and distributed among the victorious Scottish soldiers as a war trophy, a tangible memento of their incredible victory. And legend, perpetuated by chroniclers like Blind Harry, adds an even more personal and chilling touch to this act. It is said that William Wallace himself, the architect of the victory, claimed a broad piece of Cressingham's skin, which stretched odd from the head to the heel. With it, the stories tell, he had a baldric made for his great sword, a perpetual and grim reminder, worn on his own body, of the price of tyranny and the sweet, though bloody, taste of vengeance and freedom.